The world is in the middle of a climate change crisis, and you've probably noticed how the weather has become more extreme and unpredictable. For instance, last year, Nigeria dealt with severe droughts that affected farming and food supply. This year, however, many regions are experiencing flooding due to several days of heavy rainfall. The weather isn't just unpredictable anymore, it's getting worse. This is why climate change activists and world leaders are working on making changes and implementing policies to reduce the impact of climate change in the coming years. In 2021, Nigeria made a significant commitment at COP26, the global conference where world leaders discussed climate change issues. The then President Muhammadu Buhari pledged that Nigeria would achieve net zero emissions by 2060. Shortly after, he signed the Climate Change Act into law. But what exactly is net zero? How can this act help the country achieve it? And are we on track to meeting this goal? Let's break this down. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns, especially the rise in global temperature. It is caused by what's known as the greenhouse effect. Here's how it works. So the Earth gets energy from the sun, which heats up the planet. Some of this heat is supposed to escape back into space, but greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane trap some of the heat in the atmosphere. This is similar to how a greenhouse for a plant works. Sunlight comes in, the heat gets trapped, and it keeps the insides warm. Now, both of these gases, CO2 and methane, are naturally occurring. But the problem is that human activities like burning coal, oil, and gas, also known as fossil fuels, deforestation and industrial processes are adding more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The more of these gases, the more heat gets trapped and the warmer our planet gets. This warming is what we call global warming, and it's a big part of climate change. Hi, Mansoor. So, what are the major contributors of climate change in Nigeria?
Well, they are basically the same contributors of climate change everywhere else, except that, of course, we have specific activities that we do here that enhances directly the release of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Like our transport industry is implicated, our general industry is implicated, and we have our power generation too is implicated. So we have the release of carbon dioxide from our engines when we use our vehicles, and we have, in the aspect of our power generation, we often see ourselves as a hydroelectric power generated country, but that is not the case, because most of our electricity generation is from gas plants, and the natural byproduct of gas emission is methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And so these three main industries are including others, but these three main industries are the major contributors of climate change or the release of greenhouse gas into our atmosphere here in Nigeria. So all of these emissions from these various sources, they make, at least from our own part, may contribute to making the planet warmer.
As the planet gets warm, it triggers various changes in the environment. Some places experience more intense storms, heat waves, and droughts. Some animal species go extinct because they cannot survive in the changing environment. Melting ice caps and glaciers, rising sea levels, Amazon rainforest fires, and many more consequences. To mitigate these consequences, Nigeria committed to achieving net zero by 2060. Net zero is when the amount of greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere is balanced by the amount taken out. Imagine you have a scale. On one side, you have all the emissions you create, like when you drive a car or use electricity from a power plant that burns fossil fuels. On the other side, You have things that remove gases from the air, like planting trees, which absorb carbon dioxide. Reaching net zero means making sure both sides of that scale are equal. So even if you're still putting some emissions into the air, you're also doing enough to take them out so that the total impact on the environment is zero. Nigeria's climate change efforts started with the Nigeria Climate Change Policy Response Strategy, NCCPRS, in 2012. It aimed to promote low carbon emissions and respond effectively to the impact of climate change, such as extreme weather events and food insecurity. In 2021, the Federal Ministry of Environment introduced the National Climate Change Policy, NCCP, for 2021 to 2030. This policy details Nigeria's plan to build a climate-resilient economy and reduce the impact of climate change across different sectors. Then the Climate Change Act was signed into law by President Muhammadu Buhari in November 2021. Firstly, the Act creates the National Council on Climate Change, NCCC. The Council sets climate change policies, manages the Climate Change Fund, works with the Federal Inland Revenue Service on carbon taxes, and oversees emission targets. It includes members from different government ministries, a private sector representative, and representatives for women, youth, and people with disabilities. Secondly, the Act tasks the NCCC with the responsibility to develop a 5-year plan for Nigeria. This plan will set carbon limits, outline emission targets for different sectors, provide incentives for reducing emissions, and ensure compliance with international agreements. So is Nigeria on track to achieving net zero?
Well, apart from the fact that we have a challenge measuring these indices right now, we have a lot of plans, we have a lot of policies put in place for achieving this. We've revised it a couple of times, but so far I don't think there's any clear-cut or direct process or direct measures we're using to at least cut down on greenhouse gas emission. We've tried with some avenues of electric vehicles, like the recent use of electric vehicles in Borno State, but that is a novelty. Just that we need to go a lot more than that nationally. We need to touch a lot more industries using these alternative means of power generation. But as it stands now, the only thing we have to boast of is our policies and our pledges to the international communities that we have a plan, we have a climate change plan to reduce our own emissions. So far, I don't see any significant process right now.
So far, the plan has made some headway with setting up frameworks and pushing for emission reductions. But there are notable areas where it has fallen short. For instance, gas flaring, a major environmental concern, increased in early 2023, showing a disconnect between policy and action. Also, moving to cleaner energy in key areas like industry and cooking has been slow, mainly because changing business practices and attitudes towards climate change is challenging. Nigeria's electricity is predominantly sourced from fossil fuels, which make up about 80% of the capacity, while only 20% comes from hydropower. But the country only caters for 14% of the country's power supply. As a result, many Nigerians rely on generators which increase carbon emissions. A 2022 study shows that generators in Lagos alone emit 1.5 million tons of CO2 annually. 1 ton of CO2 is equivalent to 500 fire extinguishers. Now imagine 1.5 million tons. That's 750 million fire extinguishers. Nigeria's total carbon emissions as of 2022 was 122,750,410 tons. What does climate change have to do with the recent floods in Borno and floods in places like Lagos and Kogi, which have been recurring over the years?
Okay, yeah. So when we talk about anthropogenic climate change, we are talking about the impact, what human beings have done to affect climate. Because climate change on its own has its own natural occurrence. We have periods where climate change from different extreme weather events naturally, where we have ice ages, where we have warm periods, where we have oxygen booms of the earth. So when we bring it to the context of these floods here, we understand all these elements of climate change. We understand climate variabilities. We understand fluctuations and patterns. And we can say we want to attribute some of these extreme weather events like the floods that happens sometimes occasionally, sometimes seasonally they happen, but there are some that happens annually, like the ones in these two places you mentioned. When we talk of anthropogenic climate change, we also have to talk of not just the gases we are releasing as people, we also have to talk of the measures we are putting in place to curb or to manage the release of these greenhouse gases. In that aspect now, if we're looking at it from that perspective now, we'll look at things like accountability. Do we enact the right policies to account for this gas emission? Do we spend or appropriate the funds that are put in place for climate change measures? Because once you've curbed the measures at this point we cannot just say we are reversing the process. It's a bigger issue that we are trying to achieve. But before we get there, we have to start from the perspective of addressing the impact of what is already happening. So when we don't put those measures, yes, we are actually contributing to human-induced climate change, actually contributing to these disasters. So from that perspective, you can think of it like that.
Thirdly, the Act sets up a fund to collect money from carbon taxes, emission trading, the National Assembly, and other sources. This fund will help pay for climate change projects, reward those who cut greenhouse gas emissions, assess the impact of climate change, and support the National Climate Change Council. Under the Climate Change Act, anyone, whether a person or an organization, that harms climate change efforts or breaks any rules set by the Act can be penalized. The Council will decide the penalties for such offenses. Like any policy, effective implementation is key to achieving the goals of this Act. Climate change is an emergency. The unpredictable and extreme weather events have worsened food insecurity, displacement, and disease in Nigeria. This calls for more deliberate action and urgency to address both the immediate and long-term impacts of climate change.